The wind off the high ridge had already turned the deep ruts of Main Street to iron when Martha began to speak, her voice built for distance and filled with a cold, sharp malice that could cut through the thickest winter coats. It was a Tuesday, which meant the local feed store was open and most of the town was out, wrapped in heavy wool and seeking the meager warmth of the morning sun. They gathered on the timber boardwalks, their heavy boots kicking against the frozen pine, drawn together by the dark, compelling spectacle of public judgment. Martha stood elevated on the porch of the dry goods store, her chin held high and her gloved finger pointed directly at the young woman who stood solitary in the middle of the freezing street. At the young woman's feet sat a single, worn wooden satchel, its leather straps cracked by years of hard travel and cold rain. Martha told the gathering crowd that this stranger was nothing but a fraud, a traveling charlatan who preyed on the desperate and the sick with useless bottles of colored water and dry herbs. She spoke loudly of the small tin of ointment she had purchased for her young nephew's deep, rattling cough, an ointment that had done absolutely nothing to ease the boy's suffering. She said there was a word for a woman who traveled the territories alone, unattached, and carrying a bag of strange remedies, and she made sure everyone knew that the word was not a kind one. A few men chuckled, their breath rising in white plumes in the dry winter air. It was the kind of laughter that grew from boredom and the cruel comfort of seeing someone else positioned lower than themselves. Others simply watched, their faces hardened by the relentless frontier winter, neither defending nor joining in the scorn. Molly stood perfectly still in the freezing mud. She was 25 years old, but her eyes held the heavy, patient stillness of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. She had stood in dusty streets like this before, in towns whose names she could barely remember, facing the exact same accusations from people who feared what they did not understand. She did not flinch, she did not raise her voice, and she did not offer an apology. There was a dignity in her silence, a quiet defiance that some in the crowd misread as a confession of guilt, while others might have recognized it as the profound patience of a true healer, had they possessed the eyes to see it. Across the street, leaning against the rough-hewn cedar post outside the feed store, Frank watched. He was a tall man, built broad, but carrying himself with a deliberate slowness that made him seem almost a part of the landscape. His hat was pulled low, casting a dark shadow over his weathered face and the deep-set eyes that rarely missed a movement in the valley. Frank was not a man who spoke into other people's business without a damn good reason, and he had spent the last 34 years of his life minding his own ranch, his own cattle, and his own silence. He had survived the harshness of the frontier by knowing exactly where his boundaries lay and never stepping over them unless forced. But as he watched the young woman stand solitary in the dirt, surrounded by a wall of cold faces, something shifted in the quiet spaces of his mind. The two of them, the shamed woman in the middle of Main Street and the stoic rancher leaning against the wooden post, were the only still elements in a town that seemed to move only to gossip and condemn. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly, stood by, and wondered if you should have spoken up? The frontier was a place where survival often meant looking away, but true humanity was defined by those who refused to let an innocent soul break. As we begin this journey into the cold Montana mountains, I want to ask you, do you believe that silence in the face of injustice is a choice of its own? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, as your reflections bring life to these forgotten corners of our history. The tension on the street was suddenly shattered by a frantic, echoing shout from the direction of the timber mill down by the river. The rhythmic hum of the town's daily commerce instantly halted as 2 large men came running up the road, slipping on the frozen ruts of mud. Between them, they carried a boy, his small frame limp and shivering in the bitter cold. His right hand was wrapped tightly in a coarse, heavy feed sack, but the fabric was already saturated, turning a dark, ominous crimson that dripped onto the frozen ground. The men were screaming for Dr. Henry, their voices raw with a panic that instantly cut through the gossiping crowd. From the edge of the boardwalk, an older merchant shouted back the bitter truth. Dr. Henry had ridden out 3 weeks ago on his High Valley circuit, and with the heavy storm clouds gathering over the northern peak, he wasn't expected back before the first deep snow of winter settled in. The boy's name was Charlie. He was only 14, a slender lad with dirt-streaked cheeks who had taken a man's place at the massive timber saws because his father's back had given out under a load of green pine the previous winter. The iron teeth of the great blade had found 3 of his fingers, tearing through skin, muscle, and bone rather than cutting cleanly. The men who carried him were wild-eyed, their faces pale with the terrifying knowledge of what a runaway infection could do to a child in an isolated valley. But young Charlie had gone somewhere deeply quiet inside himself. His eyes were wide, glassy, and vacant, staring up at the cold blue sky without truly seeing it. It was the quiet of a body that had reached the absolute limit of what pain it could register, retreating into the silent shadows of shock. Frank did not hesitate. He stepped off the wooden porch of the feed store, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the frozen dirt as he walked directly past the stunned onlookers. He did not spare a glance for Martha, who had suddenly fallen silent, her pointed finger dropping to her side. He walked straight to where Molly stood beside her wooden satchel. He looked down at her hands, which were steady despite the freezing wind, and then he looked in her dark, unwavering eyes. "Can you stitch a wound?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly, and carrying a quiet authority that brooked no debate. It was not truly a question, but a recognition of the only real hope the boy had left. Molly did not answer with words. Instead, she was already kneeling in the dirt, her fingers working the familiar brass buckles of her satchel with a practiced, fluid speed. She lifted the heavy wooden box and stood up, her eyes locked onto the shivering boy. "Lay him on the wide table inside the feed store," she commanded, her voice clear and remarkably steady. "The light is good there, and the timber is clean." The crowd, which had been laughing and mocking her mere minutes ago, parted in a wave of stunned silence as Frank and the mill workers carried Charlie through the heavy door. They crowded around the threshold and the glass windows, their breath fogging the panes as they watched the shamed woman prepare to do what no one else in the valley could. Molly stepped inside the feed store, the scent of sweet grain and dry burlap hanging thick in the air. She immediately called for clean, hot water, a kerosene lamp to be brought close to the table, and someone strong to hold the boy's arm perfectly still. Frank stepped forward without a word and took Charlie's arm in his massive, scarred hands. He did not look away from the terrible wound, and he did not speak. And when Molly began to wash the torn flesh, and Charlie let out a low, agonizing sound from the depths of his throat, Frank placed his other hand firmly on the boy's shoulder and kept it there, providing a steady, unyielding anchor of human warmth in the midst of the pain. Molly worked the way water moves, smooth, fluid, and without a single wasted motion. Her hands were not the delicate, pale hands of town lady. They were hands that had done this hard work before, hands that carried the memory of healing in their very bones. As she threaded her bone needle, she remembered the first time she had held a thread under Ruth's watchful eye. She remembered the smell of the carbolic wash and the soft, reassuring murmur of her mentor's voice. Now, in the dim light of the feed store, with the smell of horse feed and cold iron hanging in the air, she was the one who had to bring the calm. Her fingers worked through the torn tissue of Charlie's hand, saving the first 2 fingers entirely, and carefully aligning the jagged skin of the third so that he might retain its use in the coming years. Frank watched her hands without meaning to, mesmerized by the absolute sureness of her movements. She was so young, he thought. Young and certain in a way that had nothing to do with youth, but rather with a soul that had been forged in the fires of necessity. If you are ready for this epic journey of quiet honor, survival, and a love that whispers against the loudest storms of judgment, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from today. Hit that like button, subscribe to Redwood Chronicles, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter of our upcoming stories. Your support is the heartbeat that keeps these forgotten tales of the American frontier alive. The silence that settled inside the feed store after the last stitch was pulled was heavier than the cold air pressing against the glass. Charlie lay back on the wide oak table, his breathing having slowed from a ragged gasp to a shallow, exhausted rhythm. The white linen wrapping his hand was neat, flat, and already growing cold in the dimming light. Molly stood over him for a long moment, her hand resting lightly on his forearm just above the clean bandage, monitoring the subtle flutter of his pulse. It was a gesture of quiet assurance, a silent contract between the healer and the healed that the worst of the storm had finally passed. Frank did not immediately let go of the boy's wrist. His large, calloused fingers remained anchored on the sleeve of Charlie's wool coat, feeling the gradual return of warmth to the boy's skin. He looked up at Molly, his gaze dropping to the wooden satchel that sat open on the floorboards beside her. The glass bottles inside rattled slightly as the rising mountain wind rattled the heavy timber frame of the building. Without a word, Frank leaned down, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the grain sacks as he closed the lid of the satchel and fastened the tarnished brass buckles. He rose slowly, turning his attention to the two mill hands who had stood frozen by the doorway, their hats held tightly in their hands like men standing before a judge. "Take him home," Frank said, his voice flat and low, leaving no room for discussion or hesitation. "Keep the hand dry and keep him warm. The fever shouldn't find him tonight, but if it does, you know where to ride." The men nodded quickly, eager to escape the suffocating quiet of the room. They lifted Charlie with a new gentleness, carrying him out into the freezing gray light of Main Street, where the crowd had begun to disperse into the shadows of the boardwalks. The gossiping voices of the morning had vanished, replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind through the alleyways and the distant, rhythmic clatter of a blacksmith's hammer. The town had seen a miracle, but on the frontier, gratitude was a currency rarely spent in public. Have you ever noticed how quickly a crowd will turn silent when their accusations are met with quiet, undeniable capability? It is easy to judge from the safety of a boardwalk, but when the shadows lengthen, it is the quiet, capable souls who keep the cold at bay. If you believe that a person's true character is revealed through their actions rather than the whispers of others, take a moment to hit that like button and write truth in the comments. Your engagement helps us share these timeless stories of the Old West. Molly did not watch them leave. Instead, she knelt to retrieve her satchel, but Frank's hand was already there, his fingers wrapping around the smooth hickory handle before she could reach it. He lifted the weight of the box easily, carrying it in a way that made its heavy contents seem like nothing at all. He turned to the store clerk who stood behind the counter, staring at the dark stains left on his clean table. Frank reached deep into his pocket, pulled out 2 silver coins, and laid them on the wood. "For the clean cloth and the light," Frank said plainly. The clerk took the coins without looking Frank in the eye, nodding once before dropping them into a drawer. Frank turned back to Molly, his hat still pulled low, his eyes searching hers with a steady, unhurried curiosity. He told her that the boarding house at the end of the street had no rooms left. The delayed freight wagons had been stuck up in the high pass for 3 days, and the teamsters had taken up every spare cot from here to the livery. He did not offer an apology for the town's lack of hospitality, nor did he make a grand show of his next words. He simply stated the reality of the situation as it stood on that cold winter afternoon. "The ranch is 2 miles out," Frank said, his voice steady as the timber post behind him. "There's a back room off the kitchen. It has a cot, a small cast iron stove, and a window that looks out toward the winter pasture. You're welcome to it until the circuit doctor rides back through the valley." Molly looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the yellow glow of the single kerosene lamp on the counter. She had lived a life of temporary shelters, of barns and cold wagon beds, of places where she was tolerated only until her satchel was empty. No one had ever offered her a room simply because the cold was coming. She did not ask about his intentions, nor did she look for the hidden catches that usually came with a stranger's kindness. She saw the honesty in the rugged lines of his face, a face that had been carved by 30 winters of hard labor and solitude. "I'll take the room," she said quietly. The ride out of town was silent, the road frozen so hard that the horses' hooves rang like iron against stone with every stride. Molly sat behind him on the broad gelding, her boots tucked high, her hands holding the wooden satchel flat across her lap rather than reaching around his waist. There was a deliberate distance between them, a boundary of respect that neither felt the need to cross with words. The wind came off the northern peaks in great, freezing sweeps, lifting the dry dust of the road and scattering it across the brown grass of the empty pastures. The twilight was fading fast, pulling the last stubborn colors out of the sky and leaving only a deep, bruised purple that settled over the pine forests. When they reached the ranch, the house appeared as a low, dark silhouette against the vast sweep of the hills. It was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, built close to the earth to survive the mountain gales. Frank led the horse to the rail, dismounted with a practiced, heavy grace, and held the stirrup steady for her. She slipped down, her boots landing with a soft thud on the frozen dirt, her knees slightly stiff from the cold ride. He led her around the side of the main house to a small, heavy door that sat beneath the low overhang of the kitchen roof. He pushed it open, and the smell of dry cedar, old flour, and the cold stillness of an unused space drifted out to meet them. The room was small, but it was clean. A simple iron cot stood against the far wall, covered by a heavy wool blanket, and in the corner sat a small, black stove with a stack of split pine piled neatly beside it. A single window looked out over the pasture, where the split-rail fence marked the boundary of the dark woods beyond. "It has its own door," Frank said, gesturing to the heavy latch. "The town can say what it wants, but they won't have cause to say it here." It was a small detail, but to a woman who had spent her life guarding her reputation in hostile towns, it was a gesture of immense decency. Frank knelt before the stove, his large hands working with the dry cedar, kindling, and a single match. The yellow flame caught quickly, casting a warm, dancing glow across the rough pine floorboards and the whitewashed walls. He stood up, dusted the wood shavings from his trousers, and looked at her one last time before stepping back toward the kitchen door. "The wood is dry," he said quietly. "I'll be in the main house if the wind gets too high." Molly stood in the center of the small room, the heat from the stove already beginning to push the chill back into the corners. She set her wooden satchel down beside the cot, her fingers tracing the worn leather straps with a quiet, reflective slowness. For the first time in many years, she did not feel the immediate urge to pack her things and prepare for the morning's retreat. The fire crackled softly in the iron grate, and as the night finally settled over the silent ridge, she sat on the edge of the cot and closed her eyes, listening to the steady, reassuring whisper of the wind against the logs. The frost on the small window pane was the first thing Molly saw when the gray light of dawn finally broke over the eastern ridge. It had formed during the deepest hours of the night, a delicate, frozen forest of white ferns climbing up the glass, thick enough to completely obscure the dark pine trees and the pasture beyond. She lay still for a moment beneath the heavy wool blanket, listening to the house. The frontier has a way of breathing in the winter, a low, sighing creak of timber under the weight of the mountain wind. From the main kitchen on the other side of her heavy door, she heard the first soft, familiar sounds of the morning. The iron lid of the cook stove being lifted, the dry rattle of cedar kindling, and the rhythmic hollow scrape of a shovel clearing the cold ash. Molly rose from her cot, her bare feet instantly finding the biting chill of the pine floorboards. She pulled her heavy knitted shawl tight around her shoulders, her movements deliberate and silent as she dressed in the dim light. She fastened her boots, her fingers cold but steady, before turning to the small wooden table where her satchel sat. She ran her palm over the smooth hickory handle, a silent habit she had formed over years of uncertain mornings. In this small room, with the heat from her own little stove beginning to fight back the drafts, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a lack of urgency. There was no stagecoach to catch, no hostile town marshal watching from the shadows of the livery, and no packing of bags before the sun could fully rise. By the time she pushed open the connecting door and stepped into the main kitchen, Frank was already standing by the wash basin. The room was filled with the sharp, clean scent of burning cedar and the rich, dark aroma of boiling coffee. He did not turn around immediately, but his broad shoulders shifted slightly in acknowledgement of her presence. He washed his hands, his movements slow and thorough, before drying them on a coarse linen towel. He poured 2 cups of black coffee into heavy tin mugs, placing one on the scrub pine table where she usually sat. "Cold's holding," Frank said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that seemed to belong to the early morning hours. "It is," Molly replied, taking her seat and wrapping her hands around the warm tin mug. "The wind has a bite to it today." They ate their morning meal without further ceremony, a quiet partnership of silence that required no small talk to fill the spaces. For 30 years, Frank had eaten his breakfast alone in this cabin, his only company being the ticking of the regulator clock on the log wall. Yet, as he watched Molly quietly sip her coffee, looking out at the white frost on the fence posts, the house felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Word travels in an isolated mountain valley the way weather does, low, fast, and always ahead of itself. By the next afternoon, the people of the valley knew exactly where Molly was staying, and they had already begun to forget the harsh words Martha had spoken on the timber boardwalk. When the winter cold settles deep into the bones, pride is a luxury few settlers can afford to keep. It was a Thursday afternoon when the first visitor arrived at the ranch. Silas Abernathy, an older farmer from the creek bottom, came riding up the lane on a shaggy, frost-covered mule. Even from the porch, Molly could hear the dry, rattling scrape in the man's chest with every breath he took, a sound like dry corn husks being dragged across a rough stone floor. Silas climbed down from his mount with great difficulty, his face a pale, pasty gray beneath his worn beaver skin hat. Molly did not wait for him to knock. She opened the heavy door, her eyes immediately assessing the blue tint around the old man's lips. She led him straight to the warmth of the cook stove, helping him slip off his heavy coat, which was stiff with frozen grease and dirt. She had him sit on a sturdy wooden stool, then knelt behind him. Frank stood by the woodbox, his large hands resting on his belt as he watched. Molly did not use any grand instruments. She simply pressed her ear directly against the old man's worn flannel shirt, closing her eyes to shut out the light of the room. She stayed that way for a long time, perfectly still, listening to the dark, fluid struggle inside the old farmer's lungs with the intense concentration of a scholar reading a rare and ancient book. When she opened her eyes, she did not look worried. She rose quietly and walked to her satchel, returning with a small amber bottle of sweet clover syrup and dry pine bark. She explained to Silas how to take the medicine 3 times a day, but more importantly, she showed him how to prop his head up with sacks of straw when he slept so the heavy fluid would not settle in his chest during the cold nights. Silas listened to her every word, his eyes wide with the desperate attention of a man who knew how easily a winter cough could turn into a graveyard mound before the spring thaw. When he left, riding back down the frozen lane, he sat a little straighter on his mule, his breathing already resting easier. Have you ever noticed how the quietest acts of care are often the ones that carry the greatest weight? In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, it is the silent, steady hands that truly heal the broken pieces of our lives. If you believe that quiet kindness is the ultimate strength, take a moment to leave a comment below with the word kindness, and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. Your voice is a vital part of our frontier family. In the days that followed Silas's visit, the path to Frank's ranch became a well-worn trail. The mothers came next, bringing infants with hot, dry skin wrapped in layers of damp wool. The woodcutters came with deep, jagged splinters embedded in their palms, and the older folks came with joints that swelled and ached with every drop of the barometer. Molly handled each person who crossed the threshold with the exact same quiet, unhurried grace. She did not make more of their suffering than it was, and she did not offer empty promises of quick miracles. She simply did the work that was before her, her hands sure and steady, her voice a calm, even anchor in the midst of their fear. Frank observed all of it from the shadows of the room, saying nothing but missing nothing. He saw the way she spoke to the frightened young mothers, using a low, soothing register that seemed to wrap around them like a warm blanket. He saw the meticulous, almost sacred order she maintained within her wooden satchel. Every glass bottle, every dried herb, and every bone needle went back to its exact, designated place the moment she finished using it, without her ever having to look. She was incredibly useful to the valley, and because she was useful, she was suddenly welcome. But as Frank watched her pack her bag after a long day of treating the sick, he realized a hard truth about the frontier. Being useful to people is not the same as being truly known by them. The townspeople wanted what her hands could do, but they still did not ask about the woman behind the satchel. On a late Thursday evening, Frank came in long after the dark had settled, his coat white with the first true snowflakes of the season. The kitchen was warm, and the table was already set for supper, the yellow light of a single kerosene lamp casting long, gentle shadows across the log walls. Molly was sitting near the lamp, her notes and Ruth's old books spread out before her fingers tracing the faded ink of a recipe written decades ago. He washed his hands at the tin basin, the water splashing softly in the quiet room. "You didn't have to wait on the food," Molly said softly, her eyes not rising from the page. "It keeps fine on the back of the stove." "It's fine," Frank replied, sitting down across from her. They served themselves, the simple meal of salt pork and dried beans tasting better for the warmth of the room. Outside, the mountain wind had begun to rise, pressing against the heavy eaves of the house with a low, mournful whistle. A sudden, sharp crackle from the dry pine logs inside the stove broke the silence, sending a small shower of orange sparks dancing behind the iron grate. Frank looked at her across the table, his weathered face softened by the lamplight. "The fence on the north ridge is done," he said quietly. "It'll hold through the hard freeze." Molly set her fork down, her dark eyes meeting his. "That's good." Silas Abernathy's chest was much clearer when his boy came for more syrup this morning. "I think the old man will make it through to spring." Frank nodded, but he did not look back down his plate. He simply looked at her, and she looked back. In that warm kitchen, with the winter storm beginning to howl against the glass, there was no need for grand words or sudden declarations. It was just two quiet souls sitting together, and it carried the deep, undeniable weight of a story that had been written in the stars long before either of them had ever met. The sky had turned a deep, bruised blue when Frank came around the side of the house, his coat unbuttoned against the biting chill. The cold was settling in properly now, making the heavy timber of the cabin groan and turning the horse's breath to white plumes in the twilight air. In his hands, he carried 2 cups of black coffee, the steam rising in thin wisps. He found Molly sitting on the long cedar bench that ran along the front wall of the kitchen, her hands resting flat in her lap, completely empty. She was watching the last pale light of the day slip behind the peaks, her face perfectly still. Frank sat down beside her on the cold timber bench, his broad frame settling with a quiet slowness. He did not ask if she was cold. He merely handed her one of the cups, his large fingers briefly brushing against her knuckles. The warmth of the tin was a small comfort against the rising draft. For a long time, neither of them said anything. In the corral below, one of the geldings shifted its weight, blowing out a long, rattling breath that hung in the frosty air before dissolving into the dark. Have you ever sat in silence with someone and realized that the lack of words spoke far louder than any conversation ever could? In the vast, lonely stretches of the Old West, finding someone who could share your silence without needing to fill it with empty noise was a rare and precious shelter. If you have ever felt the deep, healing comfort of a quiet presence during a difficult season of your life, let us know by leaving a comment with the word presence below. Your shared experiences bring a warmth that no winter wind can steal. Frank turned his tin cup slowly in his hands, watching the dark liquid ripple. He looked out toward the darkened pasture, his voice low when he finally broke the quiet. "Where'd you learn it?" he asked, the words simple and direct. He did not ask to verify her license, nor did he ask because he doubted her. He asked because he wanted to understand the road that had brought her to his door. Molly did not turn her head, her gaze remaining fixed on the dark silhouette of the mountain ridge. "A woman named Ruth over in Carver County," she said, her voice soft but clear. "She took me on when I was 14. She paused, letting the memory settle before she continued. Frank did not press her. He simply waited, his steady presence giving her the room she needed to speak of things she had kept locked away. "I grew up in the orphanage there," Molly said, her fingers tightening around the warm tin of her cup. "Ruth used to come by when the children were sick, and I started following her around, carrying her water, until she finally let me help. She died when I was 22, leaving me her satchel and her books. It was enough to start with. The last trace of orange light vanished, leaving only the cold stars to look down upon the ranch." Molly took a slow sip of her coffee. "After that, I just kept moving from town to town," she said plainly. "People need what I know, and I go where they need it." She spoke without asking for anything. But Frank could hear the unspoken truth. She had never once been asked to explain herself before to anyone who actually cared to listen. She did not quite know what it felt like to be seen as a person. Frank turned his cup in his hands, his boots steady on the frozen dirt. "Must get lonesome," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Town to town." Molly considered his words honestly. "You stop noticing after a while," she said. "Or you think you do." Frank looked at her then, not quickly, but directly and without apology. It was the look of a man who had decided to look straight at the truth of the woman sitting beside him. Molly held his gaze, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. After a moment, Frank stood up and picked up both cups. "Cold's coming in," he said. Molly rose beside him, her joints stiff from the freeze, and they walked together into the warmth of the kitchen. The heavy oak door closed behind them, and as the latch clicked, the dark winter night settled completely over the solitary ranch, wrapping them in a shared, quiet sanctuary. But the peace of the silent ridge was not to last. During the third week of her stay, a dark rumor came to town. A traveler had brought the story to the store, and Martha made sure everyone heard it. They said a woman had died in another town under Molly's care, and that a family had buried their mother because of her. The fragile warmth that had been slowly building pulled back instantly, like water before a frost. The trail to the ranch became quiet once more, and the old man stopped coming by. Molly did not attempt to defend herself. The habit of silence was deep, and she simply went on with her chores, her face pale but composed. Frank heard the talk on a Friday in the feed store from two men who did not know he was behind them. He did not confront them. He simply paid the clerk and rode back in a heavy, brooding silence. When he arrived, he split wood for a long while in the cold with furious, desperate precision. Only when the light had begun to fail did he finally set the axe aside, wipe his brow, and walk toward the warm glow of the kitchen window. He stepped inside, the cold air rushing in with him. Molly was sitting at the pine table, her notes spread out before her, but she had not lit the lamp. She sat in the gathering gloom, her fingers resting lightly on the pages of her book. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. The quiet held between them for a long time, heavy and suffocating, before he finally spoke. "There's talk about a woman dying," he said, his voice flat. Molly set her pen down slowly, her eyes dropping to her hands on the table. "A mother," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The baby was turned wrong, and she had been that way for too long before I arrived. I stayed the whole night, but there was nothing to be done by the time I got there." She stopped, her chest rising and falling with a shallow, painful breath. "I stayed anyway," she whispered. "I stayed because no one should have to go into the dark alone." Frank looked at her for a long, silent moment, reading the deep, unvarnished truth in her eyes. He saw the sorrow she carried, a sorrow that had nothing to do with guilt. "All right," Frank said simply. He went back to the window, his broad back turned as he stared out at the gathering storm. Molly sat alone for a long time after he left, her hands still resting on the wood, the low light of the embers casting her long, lonely shadow against the wall. But in the quiet of the kitchen, she realized that he had believed her without requiring a single oath, and for the first time in her life, the heavy silence did not feel like a prison, but a promise. The news did not arrive with a flourish, but rather with the heavy, flat thud of a canvas mail pouch dropped onto the counter of the post office. It was late in the 5th week of the freeze, a time when the mountain passes were choked with white drifts and the valley felt entirely cut off from the rest of the territory. The postmaster, a squint-eyed man with ink-stained fingers, pinned a letter to the raw pine wall beside the tax notices, his movements slow and deliberate. The ink was faded, having traveled across 2 states on the back of a freezing stagecoach, but the words were perfectly clear. Dr. Henry had taken a permanent post east of the mountains, and he would not be returning to the High Valley Circuit. For a day or two, the townspeople stood around that notice, their gloved hands tucked deep into their pockets, staring at the paper as if they could change the ink by looking at it. They had spent weeks whispering about Molly, building a wall of cold silence around her name because of a rumor brought by a passing teamster. But the frontier is an unforgiving master, and it does not allow for the luxury of long-held grudges when the winter is deep and the nearest help is a 3-week ride through a blizzard. One by one, the settlers began to look at their own swollen joints, their coughing children, and the dark, angry lines of infected wood splinters beneath their skin. Pride is a warm coat, but it does not cure the croup or set a shattered bone. Quietly, and without anyone making a formal decision or offering an apology, the path to Frank's ranch began to show signs of life again. They did not come in the bright light of midday, nor did they bring their families in a grand wagon. They came at dusk, or in the gray hours before the sun could fully clear the ridge, their horses moving softly through the snow. An older man with a finger that had gone crooked and purple after a run-in with a fence-line post was the first. He stood on the porch of the small room off the kitchen, his hat held tightly over his stomach, his eyes fixed on his boots. Molly did not ask him why he had waited 2 weeks to bring the finger to her, nor did she mention the whispers that had kept him away. She simply opened her wooden satchel, retrieved her clean linen and her small bottle of carbolic wash, and set to work with the same quiet, unhurried precision she had shown since the day she arrived. Her hands were cold, but they were remarkably steady, and the old man did not even flinch as she pulled the bone back into its proper alignment. When she finished, she tied the splint with a neat, firm knot, and he left 3 eggs on her washstand before he rode away into the twilight. Have you ever had to swallow your pride and turn to someone you once doubted or misjudged? In the unforgiving valleys of the West, survival had a way of stripping away every bit of foolish pride, forcing people to see the true value of those they had cast aside. If you've ever had to make a hard peace with the truth in your own life, leave a comment with the word pride below and share your thoughts with us. Your words help us build a community as strong as the pioneers who walked these trails. After that first visitor, the silence of the ranch was broken more frequently. A young mother arrived with a child whose breathing had turned to a high, terrifying whistle. A timber faller came with a deep gash in his thigh that had begun to run hot and red, and an old woman came seeking nothing more than a tin of the willow bark tea that kept her fingers from curling into claws when the low-pressure systems rolled in off the peaks. Molly treated each of them with the same even, non-judgmental dignity. She did not look for gratitude, and she did not expect the town to change its heart. She was useful, and on the frontier, usefulness was the only currency that never lost its value. Frank watched this quiet return from the shadows of the kitchen, his large frame leaning against the doorpost, his face unreadable, but his eyes missing nothing. He saw the way the townspeople looked at her now, not with the easy mockery of Main Street, but with a cautious, desperate respect. They wanted what her hands could do, but they still kept their distance, their eyes darting toward the floorboards whenever she looked up from her work. He knew what it was to be tolerated only for what you could provide, and his heart hardened slightly against the people who came to his door seeking mercy, but offering none of their own. Then the night calls began. The first one came in the middle of a Thursday, during a howling northern gale that threatened to rip the shingles from the cabin roof. A frantic knocking rattled the heavy oak door of the kitchen, the sound sharp as pistol shots in the frozen quiet of the night. A young farmer stood on the porch, his face white with fear and his coat covered in a thick crust of wind-driven snow. His wife was in labor with their first child, and the baby had decided to come before the storm could clear. Molly was already dressing before the man could finish his plea, her fingers flying through the buttons of her wool dress in the dark. She did not hesitate, even as the wind screamed through the trees outside, throwing icy needles against the glass. She reached for her wooden satchel, but when she stepped through the connecting door into the main kitchen, she found Frank already standing by the stove. He had his heavy sheepskin coat on, his hat pulled low, and his lantern lit. He did not ask her if she was sure she wanted to go, and he did not suggest they wait for the dawn. He simply took the heavy satchel from her hand and opened the door into the freezing dark. When she walked out to the rail, she found both of his horses already saddled and waiting, their breath rising in thick, white plumes that vanished into the swirling storm. Frank helped her into the stirrup, his large hand steadying her boot with a firmness that felt like an anchor. He did not say a word as he mounted his own gelding, but as they rode out of the ranch yard and into the blinding white of the trail, he kept his horse slightly ahead of hers, his broad shoulders breaking the worst of the wind. The ride was a long, freezing struggle through drifts that reached the horses' chests, the trail visible only by the dark silhouettes of the pine trees along the ridge. When they finally reached the farmer's remote cabin, Frank took the horses to the lean-to, while Molly hurried inside with her satchel. For 5 long hours, Frank did not step foot inside the warm house. He remained outside in the freezing dark, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his boots stamping against the frozen dirt to keep the blood moving. He watched the small window of the cabin, where the yellow light of a single kerosene lamp flickered behind the frost-covered glass. He listened to the wind in the trees and the low, distant creak of the mountain timber, his thoughts his own, his presence a silent, unyielding shield between the woman inside and the cold night. And when the door finally opened in the gray light of dawn and Molly stepped out onto the porch, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear, Frank was still there. He brought the horses around without a word, helped her mount, and they rode back to the ranch in the silent, frozen morning, the deep, unspoken understanding between them having grown wider and stronger than any law the town had ever written. The winter did not merely settle over the valley. It locked it in an iron vise that grew tighter with each passing moon. The snow along the north ridge had drifted as high as the cabin's eaves, and the small window in Molly's room was now completely covered in a thick, opaque sheet of white frost that never melted, even when the little cast-iron stove was filled to the brim with dry cedar. Inside the house, the rhythm of their lives had become as steady and predictable as the ticking of the regulator clock on the log wall. Every morning before the first pale light could touch the snow, Frank would rise, his heavy boots making only the quietest creak on the floorboards as he went out to tend the stock. And by the time he returned, his beard white with frost and his hands stiff from the cold, Molly would have the black coffee boiling on the stove, the warm, rich scent of it filling the kitchen and pushing the chill back into the corners of the room. Yet, despite the quiet peace they had built within the log walls of the ranch, the world outside was still filled with the lingering whispers of the town. Martha Coleman had not forgotten her malice, even if she had been forced to silence her tongue by the sheer necessity of Molly's presence. She still watched from the boardwalks of Main Street whenever Molly rode in on Frank's broad gelding, her eyes cold, sideways, and filled with a stubborn pride that refused to bend. In a small town, a rumor is a stubborn weed. Even when you cut it down to the ground, the roots remain deep in the dirt, waiting for the first sign of rain to push their dark leaves back into the light. The settlers still carried a faint, lingering doubt, a hesitation that made them look away whenever Molly walked past, their eyes dropping to the frozen timber of the boardwalks. Have you ever known someone who would rather suffer in silence than admit they were wrong? Pride is a heavy coat to wear, especially when the winter is cold and the shadows are long. But there are some souls who would rather freeze than ask for warmth from a hand they once spat upon. If you have ever seen a hard heart finally broken by the quiet, unyielding power of grace, take a moment to hit that like button and write grace in the comments. Your thoughts are the embers that keep our community warm. It was a Friday night, during the deepest and coldest stretch of December, when the storm finally forced the town's pride to its knees. The wind had been howling off the high peak since midday, a wild, screaming gale that rattled the heavy timber shutters of the cabin and piled the dry snow in great, shifting drifts across the yard. Inside, the fire in the main cook stove was burning hot, throwing a warm, flickering yellow glow across the pine floorboards. Molly had just finished cleaning the supper plates when a sudden, desperate sound broke through the roaring of the wind. It was not the heavy, frantic knocking of frantic cattlemen, but a low, scratching scrape against the heavy oak door of her back room, the outside door that faced the pasture. Molly opened the door, and the freezing wind rushed in, carrying a swirl of white snow that hissed as it hit the hot iron of the stove. Standing on the threshold, her face pale and her eyes wide with a terrifying panic, was Martha Coleman. She was wrapped in a thin, worn shawl that offered almost no protection against the bitter gale, and her hand was shaking so violently she could barely hold the bundle pressed against her chest. Inside the damp wool of the blanket lay her young nephew, Billy, his small face a dark, dangerous purple, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull a single breath through a throat that had gone tight and dry with the croup. Every breath he took was a dry, hollow rattle, a sound like dry gravel being shaken in a tin. Pride had brought Martha halfway down the long, dark trail from town, but the terrifying fear of losing the boy had brought her the rest of the way to the shamed healer's door. She stood there on the threshold, her lips blue, unable to speak, her eyes begging for the mercy she had so loudly denied to Molly in the middle of Main Street. Molly did not hesitate, and she did not ask for an apology. She reached out, took the heavy, shivering bundle from Martha's arms, and pulled the older woman into the warmth of the room, shutting the heavy door against the screaming wind. She carried the boy straight to the iron cot, her fingers already working the damp wool blanket away from his throat. "Frank," she called out, her voice clear, calm, and commanding, cutting through the roar of the gale. The connecting door opened instantly, and Frank stepped into the room, his large frame filling the doorway. He did not ask questions. He took one look at the boy's blue lips, then at the shivering, silent Martha who stood frozen by the door, and he knew exactly what was required of him. "Get the big copper kettle filled," Molly ordered, her voice steady as an anchor, "and build the fire in the stove as hot as the iron will stand. We need steam, Frank. We need it now." For 3 long hours, the small back room off the kitchen became a battleground between life and the cold hand of the winter croup. Frank worked without a single word of complaint, his massive hands bringing bucket after bucket of clean water, keeping the small stove roaring until the iron plates glowed a deep, dull red. The room filled with a thick, heavy cloud of hot steam that smelled of sweet cedar wood smoke and the sharp, clean scent of the pine needles Molly had thrown into the boiling water to clear the boy's chest. Molly held Billy on her lap close to the stove, her hands gently but firmly rubbing his small back, her voice a low, soothing murmur that seemed to wrap around the frightened child like a warm blanket. She did not let go of him, not even when her own face was slick with sweat and her dress was damp from the steam. She watched his chest, monitoring the frantic, shallow rise and fall of his ribs, her dark eyes filled with an absolute, unwavering focus that shut out everything else in the world. Martha sat on the wooden stool by the corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs. She had spent weeks telling the town that this woman was a fraud, a useless stranger with a bag of tricks. But now, as she watched Molly's steady, tireless hands bring her nephew back from the edge of the dark, she saw the true depth of her own foolishness. She saw that Molly did not work for praise, nor did she seek the approval of the boardwalks. She worked because there was a life in front of her that needed saving, and she carried the quiet honor of her calling in her very bones. Near the 3rd hour of the morning, the harsh, rattling scrape in Billy's chest finally began to soften. His breathing went deep, slow, and easy, the dangerous purple color leaving his cheeks and being replaced by the soft, healthy pink of a sleeping child. His head slid sideways against Molly's shoulder, his small body finally relaxing into the deep, healing sleep of recovery. Molly laid him gently onto the cot, covering him with the thick wool blanket Frank had brought from the main house. She stood up, her joints cracking slightly with fatigue, and turned to Martha, who was staring down at her nephew with wet, disbelieving eyes. "The danger is past," Molly said softly, her voice low and tired but completely devoid of malice. "Keep him in the steam until the dawn, and then you can take him home. He'll need warm broth and dry clothes, but he'll keep fine now." Martha did not offer a grand apology, and she did not ask for forgiveness. She simply rose from her stool, her eyes dropping to the floorboards as she took Molly's hand in her own trembling fingers, squeezing it once with a quiet, desperate gratitude that spoke far louder than any words she could have constructed. When a morning light finally cleared the eastern peaks, turning the snow to a blinding, brilliant white, Martha carried the sleeping boy back down the lane. She did not look back, but from that day forward, she never again spoke a single word against the healer on the silent ridge. And in a town like that, her silence was an apology that carried almost as far. There's a silent, heavy price that comes with being the one everyone turns to when the world is breaking. On the frontier, a healer is expected to carry the burdens of the entire valley without ever showing a single crack in her own armor. She must be the steady hand when the mother is screaming in pain, the calm voice when the father is weeping over his child's fever, and the unyielding shield against the cold hand of death that constantly hovers over the isolated log cabins. But no one ever stops to ask who holds the healer when her own strength begins to fail, or where she goes to find shelter when the weight of everyone else's sorrow becomes too massive to carry alone. The week that followed the saving of Martha's nephew was the hardest Molly had faced since the day she stepped off the stagecoach. A sudden outbreak of the winter lung fever had swept through the lower timber camps, followed quickly by 2 incredibly difficult births that had kept her away from the ranch for 2 nights running. She had spent 36 continuous hours inside a drafty, cold cabin down by the frozen marshes of the lower creek, where a young settler's wife named Clara was struggling to bring her first child into the world. The baby was positioned wrong, stubborn and slow, and Molly had to use every ounce of her knowledge, her physical strength, and her patience to guide the young mother through the dark. She did not sleep. She did not even sit down. She simply stood by the narrow bed, her hands bathed in hot carbolic wash, her back aching with a deep, throbbing weariness as the winter wind rattled the loose, dry pine shingles overhead. And when the child was finally born, healthy and loud, in the gray, frozen hours of the second morning, there was no time for rest. A rider was already waiting at the gate, his horse covered in a lather of frozen sweat, begging her to come to the high valley where an old woodcutter's leg had been crushed beneath a sliding pine log. She packed her wooden satchel once more, her fingers stiff and trembling with fatigue, and mounted Frank's broad gelding without a single word of complaint. She rode through the blinding sleet, her head bowed against the gale, her mind numb with the sheer, relentless demands of survival. Have you ever reached a point of such profound physical and emotional exhaustion that even the simple act of standing felt like a mountain you could not climb? In those moments of absolute darkness, having a safe place and a safe soul where you can finally lay down your heavy shield is the greatest luxury on this earth. If you have ever been blessed to find that one person who lets you be weak when the rest of the world demands you be strong, let us know by leaving a comment with the word sanctuary below. Your stories of quiet support are the threads that bind us together. By the time Molly finally returned to the ranch on Friday afternoon, she was gray with exhaustion. Her eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark, hollow shadows of sleeplessness, and her hand was shaking so violently she could barely unbuckle the leather straps of her satchel. She did not possess the energy to light the small stove in her back room, nor did she have the strength to prepare a meal. She walked into the main kitchen, her boots heavy and slow on the pine floorboards, and sank into the low wooden rocking chair that sat nearest the massive stone hearth. She did not reach for her books. She did not open her notes. She simply sat there in the fading twilight, her head resting back against the smooth pine spindles, her hands lying empty and limp in her lap as the warmth of the fire slowly began to seep through her damp wool skirt. Frank came in from the stockyards long after the dark had settled over the pasture. He carried the smell of cold horse sweat, dry hay, and pine wood smoke on his heavy canvas coat. He stepped into the kitchen, his boots quiet, and paused when he saw her sitting by the hearth. He did not ask her how the births had gone, and he did not demand an account of her long days in the high valley. He saw the profound, bone-deep weariness that held her entire frame, a weariness that went far deeper than simple physical fatigue. He hung his heavy coat on the peg behind the door, washed his hands quietly at the tin basin, and sat down in the other wooden chair across the hearth. He picked up a long, thick strap of oil-tanned harness leather and his scraping knife, settling into his evening work with a deliberate, comforting slowness. The kitchen was perfectly quiet, save for the rhythmic, low scrape of his knife against the leather, the steady ticking of the regulator clock, and the soft, crackling hiss of the dry pine logs inside the cook stove. It was a sanctuary of absolute safety, a room where she was required to perform no miracles, answer no pleas, and carry no burdens. After a while, Molly's eyelids grew heavy, the flickering yellow light of the fire turning the room to a soft, warm blur. Her breathing went deep and slow. As the heavy hand of sleep finally claimed the last of her waking self, her head drifted sideways, sliding down with a gentle, unconscious ease until it came to rest firmly against Frank's broad shoulder. Frank went absolutely, perfectly still. The scraping knife remained frozen in his large right hand, hovering just above the dark leather. He did not move a single muscle, breathing softly as if the slightest shift of his frame would shatter the fragile, beautiful moment of trust she had offered him. He set the leather and the knife down on the wide timber arm of his chair with an excruciating, silent care. The fire worked in the grate, throwing long, dancing shadows across the log walls, and the winter wind pressed gently at the glass panes of the window. But inside the kitchen, there was only the steady, quiet warmth of two souls finding their center. He sat with her weight against his shoulder for many hours, his gaze fixed on the glowing red embers behind the iron grate. He knew what this was, and in the deep, silent spaces of his heart, he knew he had known it for a very long time. He did not need to speak it aloud. The frontier has a way of making the grandest truths perfectly clear without the use of a single word. He woke deep in the night, the clock on the wall indicating it was past 3. The fire had burned down to a mound of low, dull red coals, and the chill of the mountain night had begun to creep back in beneath the kitchen door. Molly was still fast asleep against his collar, her breath slow, even, and warm against his skin. Frank rose with an incredible, patient gentleness, supporting her shoulders with his hand so she would not fall as he stepped away from the chair. He walked to the wood box, added 3 heavy logs of dry cedar to the coals, and watched as the yellow flames caught once more, casting a fresh, warm light across the room. He walked to the back closet, found his heavy, double-woven wool blanket, and walked back to where she sat. He settled the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it gently around her sleeping frame with hands that tried their absolute best not to wake her. He stood there for a long moment in the quiet room, looking down at her face. In the deep sanctuary of sleep, her face had finally let go of its heavy, watchful defense. The tense lines around her mouth had vanished, replaced by the soft, simple peace of a young woman who finally felt safe. It was a good face, he thought, a face of quiet honor, strength, and a deep, unspoken beauty. He pulled on his heavy canvas coat, lit his lantern, and went out into the freezing dark of the stockyards before the first pale light of the morning could clear the eastern ridge, leaving her alone with the warmth of the fire and the quiet safety of the hearth. When Molly woke late in the morning, the kitchen was bright with the brilliant, white glare of the winter sun reflecting off the deep snow. The small stove was still throwing a generous, steady heat, and the heavy wool blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, smelling of cedar wood and the clean, cold wind. She looked across the hearth at the empty chair beside her. Resting on its wide timber arm was the length of worked harness leather Frank had been scraping the night before, alongside the small pile of wood shavings he had not yet swept away. She touched the soft, heavy wool of the blanket, her fingers tracing the neat stitches of the border, and she did not move for a very long time, her heart finally realizing that she had found the one place on the entire frontier where she was truly allowed to stay. The Saturday morning broke with a sky so clear it looked like polished glass, a pale, fragile blue that seemed almost too delicate to hold the massive, snow-laden peaks of the northern range. For several days, the low rumble of cattle had echoed through the valley as the last of the local herds were driven down from the high summer pastures to the safety of the lower valleys. It was a hard, freezing labor, one that left the cowboys and ranch hands with cracked hands and faces burned red by the bitter mountain wind, but it was also the final marker of the season's work. In the high valleys of the frontier, when the final herd is secured, it means the survival of another year has been bought and paid for. And in keeping with a custom as old as the territory itself, the completion of the drive meant the gathering of the winter festival in the town square that very night. In the afternoon, the town began to transform. From her window, Molly watched as Frank prepared the horses, his movements slow and methodical as he brushed down the broad gelding and adjusted the leather of the harness. There was a quiet energy in the air, a subtle shift from the heavy, defensive isolation of the deep winter freeze to a rare moment of shared celebration. For weeks, the town had lived under the shadow of the cold, but tonight, the lights would burn late. They would string paper lanterns between the rough timber posts of the square, casting a warm, flickering glow across the hard-packed snow. A local fiddler, an old timber worker who carried his instrument in a battered oilcloth bag, would take his place on a platform of oak planks, his bow ready to call forth the old, familiar melodies of the eastern states they had all left behind. Tables of heavy pine would be hauled out from the dry goods store, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, dried apple pies, and crocks of spice cider kept warm near the great stone hearths. It was a night for the men from the hills to shake off the quietness of their cabins, coming in with the easy, loose stride of people who had finished a hard, dangerous thing and were finally ready to set it down. Inside her small room off the kitchen, Molly stood before the washstand, looking at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. She did not possess the fine lace or silk of the merchant's daughters in town, but she had a dress of deep, dark blue wool that she kept wrapped in clean linen at the bottom of her wooden satchel. It was a simple dress, with no ornament save for the neatness of its stitches, but it had belonged to a time before her life became a series of dusty roads and cold wagon beds. She brushed her dark hair, tying it back with a simple ribbon, her fingers steady but her mind wandering to the street where she had stood only weeks ago, facing the cold scorn of the town. She had been a stranger then, a shamed traveler with nothing but a wooden box to her name. But tonight, she was going because Frank was going. It was not an announcement he had made, nor a grand request. He had simply asked if she had her shawl ready when they sat at the noon meal, and that had been enough. They rode into town as the twilight was beginning to pull the last pale yellow light from the western sky, leaving the valley in a deep, clean shadow. The road was the same hard-frozen trail they had ridden so many times in the dark, but tonight, the distant glow of the lanterns in the square appeared like a constellation of warm stars fallen into the snow. As they drew closer, the lively, rhythmic screech of the fiddle carried through the cold air, a bright, cheerful sound that seemed to defy the massive silence of the mountains. Frank led the horse to the hitching rail outside the livery, his movements quiet as he secured the reins. He did not immediately walk toward the light. He stood for a moment, adjusting his hat, his deep-set eyes scanning the bustling square before he turned to her. The square was alive with the warmth of 100 lanterns, their yellow light turning the snow to a soft, glowing gold. The smell of wood smoke, sweet cider, and damp wool hung thick in the cold air, a rich mixture of survival and comfort. Molly walked beside Frank, her boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch in the packed snow. She wore her dark blue dress, the heavy wool keeping out the worst of the draft, and she stood where the warm lamplight reached, but she did not press into the center of the crowd. She kept to the very edge of things, just as she had in every town before, present without ever truly being seen. For a traveling healer, the edge was a familiar, safe place. It was where you stood to observe, to watch the way people moved and breathed, learning their sicknesses and their sorrows before they ever had the courage to speak them aloud. Frank did not leave her side. He stood broad and solid beside her, his presence a quiet, unyielding wall against the curious glances of the townsfolk. The laughter of the cowboys and the clatter of tin cups filled the air, but the space around them remained quiet, a small circle of decency in the midst of the noise. From the corner of her eye, Molly saw Martha Coleman standing near the tables of food, her young nephew Billy holding tightly to her skirt. Martha looked over, not with the sharp, pointed malice of that freezing Tuesday, but with a quiet, lingering look that carried the memory of the hot steam and the boy's saved life. She did not turn away, and she did not speak, but her silence was a different kind of silence now, one of respect. Suddenly, the music changed. The old fiddler drew his bow in a slow, sweet waltz, the notes drifting out over the square like falling leaves. The lively clutter of the dancers slowed, and the crowd began to reorganize itself, couples stepping back to let the slower, more deliberate rhythm take hold. Frank turned his head, looking down at her from beneath the shadow of his hat. His weathered face was soft in the yellow light of the lanterns. "Dance with me," he said. Molly looked at him, her heart skipping a beat in the quiet spaces of her chest. She looked past his shoulder at the square, at the merchants, the cowboys, and the mothers who were already watching them from the corners of their eyes, their whispers dying down as they realized what the quiet rancher was asking. To dance in the center of the square was to step out of the shadows, to make a declaration that the town could no longer ignore. She looked back up into Frank's steady, waiting eyes, and without a word, she handed him her cup. He took it, setting both of their tin cups on the edge of a nearby timber table, and then he turned back and offered his hand. Molly placed her hand in his. His palm was large, rough, and scarred from decades of hard labor, but his grip was incredibly gentle, his fingers closing around hers with a firmness that felt like a promise. They walked together out of the shadows and into the bright, warm circle of the lamplight, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. Frank was not a graceful dancer. He was built too broad, his shoulders carrying the permanent weight of the heavy timber and the hard plow, and he did not move with the easy, sweeping elegance of the younger men. But he was steady, and on the frontier, where the ground is uneven and the winter is long, a steady partner is worth considerably more. Molly found the rhythm of his steps quickly, her movements matching his with an ease that surprised her. His large hand was warm and solid at her waist, holding her with a quiet respect that did not pinch, and her hand rested securely in his. He did not look at the crowd, and he did not look past her shoulder to see who was watching. He looked directly at her, his dark eyes clear, certain, and filled with an expression that had been a very long time arriving. For the duration of the song, the rest of the world seemed to fade into the dark borders of the square. The whispering of the town, the memory of the freezing mud, and the heavy satchel that had defined her life for so long were all forgotten. There was only the steady rise and fall of the fiddle, the warm light of the lanterns, and the solid, reassuring presence of the man who had given her shelter when the rest of the world had turned its back. When the song finally ended, the last long note of the fiddle dissolving into the cold night air, neither of them stepped back. They remained standing in the circle of the lamplight, his hand still resting at her waist, her hand still holding his. The crowd began to murmur, and the old fiddler tapped his boot, starting up a livelier, faster tune that sent the younger folks laughing back onto the floor. Frank looked down at her, his eyes serious, his voice a low whisper beneath the music. "Walk with me," he said. They left the bright light of the lanterns, walking away from the noise, the laughter, and the warmth of the bonfires. They walked toward the quiet, dark end of the street where the buildings ended and the open country began. Here, the fiddle music became a distant, beautiful murmur, and the cold came off the high mountain ridge clean, sharp, and smelling of deep snow. Frank stopped, looking out into the vast, silent dark of the valley, his boots planted firmly in the snow. Molly stood beside him, her shawl pulled tight, watching his face. She could see him arranging something in his mind, a careful, quiet man putting his words in the exact right order because he intended to say this thing only once in his life. "The town knows it now," Frank said, his voice low and steady. "They need what you do." He paused, the silence stretching between them like the empty pastures. He turned his head, looking directly into her eyes, the starlight reflecting in the dark circles of his gaze. "I need what you do too," he said quietly. "Not the medicine. I mean, the rest of it." Molly stood perfectly still, her breath catching in her throat, her hand trembling slightly beneath her shawl. "I'm asking you to stay," Frank said, the words plain, direct, and leaving no room for doubt. "Permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want. Not on account of practicality. I want that to be clear." And as she looked at him, she realized it was the clearest thing she had ever known. It had been clear in the quiet cup of coffee left on the table every morning before the sun could rise. It had been clear in the split cedar fire built up in her stove before she could even wake. It had been clear in the heavy wool blanket laid over her shoulders by hands that tried so hard not to disturb her rest. And it had been clear in the horse saddled and waiting outside every dark house she had been called to in the freezing cold. It had been clear on the porch in the fading light when he asked her where she had learned what she knew. The very first time in her entire life that anyone had wanted to know something about her that was not written in the contents of her wooden satchel. Molly's hand slipped out from beneath her shawl, finding his hand at his side. She placed it there, her fingers sliding against his, warm in the freezing winter air. "Yes," she said, her voice a soft, beautiful whisper that carried easily in the quiet night. "That's what I want." Frank turned his hand, his large, scarred fingers closing around hers, holding her hand with a firmness that said she would never have to walk the long, lonely roads of the frontier again. They stood together in the cold, watching the distant stars, while the fiddle played on in the warm square without them, and neither of them was in any hurry to go back. The 3 weeks that lay between the soft gold of the winter waltz and the pale, quiet morning of the wedding were weeks of a different kind of silence than either of them had ever known. It was not the heavy, defensive silence of two lonely souls keeping the world at bay behind hand-hewn log walls, but the slow, deep breath of a pasture waiting for the spring. The snow still lay thick in the shadowed coulees, and the wind off the northern peaks still carried the sharp, clean bite of the high glaciers. But the sun had begun to find a new, lingering warmth in the middle of the day. Every morning, Frank rode out to the high fence line, his broad frame silhouette against the brilliant white of the drifts, his mind occupied with the practical work of a ranch that was no longer just a shelter for one. And inside the kitchen, Molly went about her daily chores, her fingers no longer trembling when she reached for the coffee tin, her heart finally resting in the steady, predictable rhythm of a home. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky that was perfectly, beautifully pale, a clean, clear white that seemed to hold the quiet peace of the mountains within its vast, empty stretches. There was no wind on Main Street that day, only the silent, freezing cold that turned the breath of the gathering crowd into soft, white plumes that rose toward the church steeple. Fixed to the heavy oak door of the church was a single, thick bough of green pine, its sharp, clean scent mingling with the dry, cold air of the street. A simple, rustic custom of the territory that marked the coming of Christmas. It was a small, green promise of life in the midst of the frozen white valley, and as Molly walked up the wooden steps, her boots making a soft, steady sound on the timber, she kept her eyes fixed on that pine bough. More people had gathered along the boardwalks than either of them had ever expected to see. The news of the quiet rancher and the shamed healer had traveled to the furthest corners of the valley, and the settlers had come in from their isolated cabins, their horses tied to the rails for 3 blocks in either direction. But they did not come with the loud, gossiping chatter that usually filled the town on Saturday morning. They stood in a quiet, respectful line along the path to the steps, their heavy wool hats held in their gloved hands, their faces solemn and thoughtful. The townspeople who had so easily joined in Martha's harsh laughter only weeks ago were now perfectly silent, their eyes following Molly with a new, deep-seated reverence that required no grand words of apology to make itself known. Charlie stood by the heavy oak door, his small frame looking remarkably tall and straight in his Sunday flannel. His right hand was still wrapped in a light, neat layer of clean white linen, but the fingers were straight and the skin was healing clean, a testament to the sureness of Molly's needle. He held the heavy timbered door open with his good left arm, standing as proud as a sentinel, his dark eyes shining with a silent, profound gratitude that spoke of a future saved. He looked at Molly as she reached the top of the steps, and he offered her a small, quiet nod, the nod of a boy who had been brought back from the dark by a hand that did not falter. Molly carried her wooden satchel in her right hand as she walked up the steps, her fingers wrapped tight around the smooth hickory handle. It was the same satchel she had carried through 10 different territories, the same box of remedies that had been her only shield, her only companion, and her heaviest burden during years of lonely roads and cold wagon beds. It carried the memory of Ruth, the smell of the carbolic wash, and the weight of every sick room she had ever entered alone. But as she reached the threshold of the church, she stopped. She looked down at the worn leather straps, then up at Frank, who stood waiting for her beside the minister, his broad shoulders squared and his eyes holding hers with an absolute, unwavering certainty. With a slow, deliberate movement, Molly knelt on the wooden planks of the top step. She set the heavy wooden satchel down on the threshold, placing it flat against the timber outside the door. She stood back up, took a deep, clean breath of the mountain air, and stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the church without it. The people who stood on the steps saw her do it, and they said absolutely nothing, which was the only right way to receive such a profound surrender. For they understood that she was no longer entering their town as a useful shadow, a temporary healer to be tolerated only until her bag was empty. She was entering as a woman who had finally found her place, a bride who was stepping into the light of a shared future with a man who had chosen her before the first stitch was ever pulled. The minister was brief, just as Frank had asked him to be. He was an older man who had buried and married 3 generations of settlers in this valley. And he knew that on the frontier, the strongest vows are the ones that are spoken with the fewest words. The service was quiet, the simple, solemn words of the covenant carrying easily through the pine pews and out into the cold afternoon. Frank spoke his vows with a low, gravelly sureness that had no need for ornament, his hand holding hers with a steady warmth that did not shake. And when Molly spoke her promise, her voice was clear, soft, and steady as the mountains that looked down upon the roof. When it was done, they came out together into the cold afternoon sun, and Frank's large hand was at the small of her back. Not gripping, not demanding, but simply present in the way of something that had finally decided where it belonged. They walked down the wooden steps, past the silent, nodding crowd, and turned their horses toward the ridge. They walked home in the early dark, the horses moving softly through the packed snow of the road. The road was the same road they had ridden in the freezing storm, and the cold was the same cold that had threatened to break them, but the vast, empty stretches of the valley no longer felt lonely. Behind them, the town settled quietly into its evening, the thin columns of white smoke rising from the stone chimneys, and the yellow lamplight finding the windows of the cabins one by one. Come spring, the deep snows of the North Ridge finally broke, melting into rushing, clear creeks that filled the valley with the sweet, musical roar of running water. The earth turned soft and dark, smelling of damp cedar needles, wet pine bark, and the fresh, green promise of new grass. And with the spring came the sound of Frank's hammer echoing through the trees as he built a small, sturdy room on Main Street for Molly. A room with a proper timber door and a wide glass window where the sun could reach her books. The wooden satchel no longer lived on the cold floor beside her cot. It hung permanently on a sturdy iron hook beside the door of that small room, its brass buckles polished and clean. It was no longer a sign of her isolation, but of her belonging a library of mercy that the townspeople could always find when the shadows grew long. Martha Coleman passed that window, sometimes on her way to the dry goods store, her shawl tucked tight around her shoulders. She did not stop, and she did not look sideways anymore, which was as close to a formal apology as the town was ever going to get from a woman of her pride. And for Molly, as she looked out at the green pastures and the long road that led back to the ranch, it was more than enough. Molly worked, and Frank worked, and the seasons moved in their quiet, beautiful way through the high valley, while outside her window on quiet spring afternoons, you could hear the livery horses in the pen 2 streets over, their soft knickers carrying clean through the mountain air, and it was a very good sound to work to.